Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. Welcome to the latest edition of Drezburt. My name is Daniel Drezner. I am a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And I also blog at Spoiler Alerts for the Washington Post.
I am Heather Hurlburt. I lead the New Models of Policy Change project at New America and also sit as a senior fellow at Human Rights First.
But let's note that you just changed your intro. That's different from the last month. So congratulations on your New America post.
Thank you. It's a really fun project looking at, yes, there are ways to do policy advocacy effectively, even in times of high intense polarization. Mm-hmm. What are they, and how should advocates and funders of advocates think about which strategy to choose? When do you want to just go straight out partisan, let's pick a side? When do you want to try the sort of old-fashioned bipartisan meeting in the middle? And when do you want to try the strange bedfellows outside-in model? So I'm really looking forward to both, looking at the field as I know best through new eyes, and also, frankly, looking at domestic policy fields I don't know as well. So branching out a little bit and edging more into your sort of researchy territory.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to have you up here next month, so this will be, I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
Right.
But let's deal with today, which was, so we are speaking a few short hours, so 36 hours after the Obama administration or the United States started bombing various targets in Syria, both the Islamic State and, is it pronounced Khorasan? I don't know.
I'm not going to pretend I know how to pronounce it, so let's say Khorasan.
But multiple targets in Syria that are neither the Free Syria Army nor the Assad regime. And then this morning, President Obama delivered an interesting speech, I think, at the UN General Assembly. So, Heather, your first takes on these things.
So, as was noted on Twitter, this is a moment where we say, I told you so, because you and I had this discussion. I said there would be bombing in Syria, and there is.
Yeah.
I don't say this with any particular pleasure.
I was going to
say. But the thing I have to say that I didn't anticipate, so just to be a little more specific on something you said, is by my count, we're now involved in 3 separate conflicts in Syria. One being trying to degrade and weaken ISIS. Second being, as you noted, the U.S. seems to have attacked this thing called the Khorasan Group, which, as best we can tell from what's been reported, is a concatenation of sort of al-Qaeda alumni, specifically bomb makers and individuals who are focused on foreign targets, or what Osama bin Laden used to refer to as the far abroad, otherwise known as the West. So what we've been told is this is a group that had been assembling in Syria where, there was no controlling legal authority, to borrow a phrase, and that the administration had been keeping an eye on it for a while, and decided, although an attack was not imminent, that the threat was imminent. So that's now conflict number 2. And conflict number 3 is that we are at the same time moving forward on arming, quote, moderate, unquote, Syrian rebels who are, of course, fighting Assad. And the way these connect, by the way, is if you start out to degrade ISIS, what you don't want is you degrade ISIS and who moves into ISIS's space, but these other al-Qaeda offshoot groups. So then you need somebody who can control the space, who isn't ISIS, who isn't al-Qaeda, and who isn't Assad. So then you have no choice but to go into the business of arming and training more moderate groups. So on the one hand, the 3 are interconnected, and the logic of the sort of situation on the ground is that I think once you decide to do one, you are in for the others, but they are 3 separate endeavors with objectives that may at some points be conflicting.
Okay, so on the Syria thing, and we'll deal with the General Assembly speech a little bit later, your point about the fact that if you're going to degrade and destroy the Islamic State, and you need to find someone to take their place, as well, if you're going to do the same thing with the Assad regime, raises a question about timing, which is, it strikes me, so on the one hand, I was a little bit surprised at how quickly this came about. I mean, I like you, I was expecting it, but I will give the administration points. They acted a little more quickly than I was anticipating. And, I think in some ways their signal achievement so far is they actually got buy-in from 5 Arab allies, all of whom participated in the airstrikes, 4 of whom actually dropped, dropped bombs. But here's the thing: there's a mismatch between the sort of aerial part of this, which is clearly trying to degrade the Islamic State, and the ground aspect, which is every report I have read about what's going to be done with the Free Syrian Army suggests that the best case, and I cannot stress this enough, the best case outcome that you're going to get from that is maybe a year from now, you will have 5,000 moderately trained, moderate Syrian troops. So here's my question. If that's the best case scenario, then isn't this bombing been taking place a little bit sooner perhaps than it should be? Because there is no force that can fill the vacuums that you're talking about in terms of either the Assad regime or the Islamic State. And I'm not even sure if a year from now, again, best case scenario, that you'll have the capability to do that. So there's a part of this equation that I'm missing, which is can this just be done with the moderate Syrian rebels, or are you going to have other ground troops involved?
Well, I don't want to pretend that I have any kind of authoritative answer based on anybody briefing me in detail on what the strategy is. So with that caveat, what I believe to be happening is the perception that if you don't degrade ISIS now, in a year you will have a situation where they are more established and less degradable, and potentially you have lost the government in Baghdad, potentially you have lost the government in both the Syrian Kurdish area and or the Iraqi Kurdish area. We saw 100,000 new refugees into Turkey in less than 48 hours over the weekend into Monday, and there's no reason that couldn't just continue. I mean, not all of those things can happen, but some of them could. So what I think is happening is it's all very well to say, yes, it doesn't make any sense to do this until you have the ground forces trained. On the other hand, if you wait, there's not going to be anything to train ground forces to fight against. So right. I think the strategy is use air power to degrade as and until you have ground forces that can both. And by the way, the other point is, the having ground forces in Iraq that can retake territory should, and again I say should because there's no guarantees, and you are dealing with a force that was pretty demoralized and disintegrated and ran away, you should be able to start retaking territory in Iraq faster, which would then, potentially let you also deal with some of the Syria problem, although it is also true that you aren't ever going to deal with ISIS in Syria without somebody having ground troops in Syria.
Right. Although, I mean, in some ways that's why the reason I asked the question is in some ways the most depressing thing I've read this week was a front pager by the New York Times. I think it was yesterday. I want to say it was by Eric Schmidt and it was by David Kirkpatrick and his co-author, whose name unfortunately escapes me right now, pointing out that basically after a month of aerial bombardments of ISIS or ISIL in Iraq, and remember, this is a scary statement, but Iraq comparative to Syria is the easier case, because in the case of Iraq, as President Obama's pointed out, you actually have a friendly government that's invited the U.S. in. You have significant amounts of ground forces with an incentive to try to retake territory. And yet, after a month of this, basically what's happened has been a stalemate. That it's certainly arrested the Islamic State's ability to take territory, but it's not like the Iraqis or the Peshmerga have taken any more territory either. And if that's the best case outcome for Iraq, again, it strikes me that nothing is going to change the situation in Syria in terms of air power alone unless you actually get ground troops, which leads to the more provocative question I have, which is, if it's not going to be the Free Syrian Army, is it going to be someone else? And is that someone else going to wind up being the United States?
Well, this actually, to me, the short answer is no. You are not going to see anything other than special forces troops on the ground in Iraq for at least a year.
Okay.
Maybe 2. Okay, that is my next prediction. That's
and you had a good run. Okay, I'm writing this down. Hold on. Hurlburt, No, okay, go ahead.
Okay. But so then if that's the case, then what changes the tide? And this actually brings us to Obama's UN speech today, which, and this is not an original thought to me. I owe it to Mark Goldberg at UN Dispatch. But so why does Obama go to the UN and emphasize as heavily as he did the non-military aspects of counterterrorism? The answer is, in the long run, and frankly, this would be true even with U.S. ground troops. This is the lesson we ought to have learned, one of the lessons we ought to have learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. What's going to defeat, not degrade, but what's going to defeat ISIS is cutting off its supply of human and financial and operational resources. Mm-hmm. And so that means, my first thought on Obama's speech was that it had an extraordinary amount of criticism directed at our Arab partners without naming them.
Yes, there was a lot of subtweeting in that speech.
Yeah, it was like subtweeting in the UN context. So that was really maybe one of the more comprehensive critiques of the role our Arab allies have played in the region I've ever seen given by an administration official. As I say, it doesn't say what countries he's talking about anywhere. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect of it is cutting off the idea that going to fight for ISIS is a cool thing to do, which, in some ways is the biggest early success they've had. And that is why you have the administration having this foreign fighter summit. And to my mind, the really interesting question, what the UN Foreign Fighter Summit is doing is putting a lot of pressure on governments to make it harder for people to travel to the region. Now, I have questions about that on both practicability grounds and on human rights grounds, but what seems more important to me is to make it much less attractive to do so. And some of that is just when people start getting bombed and killed en masse, that makes it less attractive. But as it becomes clear that ISIS is not romantically fighting Assad and not romantically fighting an oppressive Shiite government in Iraq, what it's doing is killing and raping other Muslims. Over time, you're going to be able to degrade the flow of new people too, and that will degrade all by itself. So again, it's not going to work this month or next month.
Right.
But in the same way, look, I mean, Al-Qaeda Central was once flavor of the month, and it no longer is. Now, that took 10 years, and we don't want it to take 10 years again. We don't want to have to, lose the number of people that we and, plenty of other countries lost to Al-Qaeda. But in the long run, that's how you beat these groups.
Okay, so let me stress, first of all, I very much want you to be right. So this is not a question of whether we disagree about the ends. My concern is about the means, because in some ways my concern is that tactically it's all going to go downhill from here in terms of attacking the Islamic State. That you had the advantage of surprise in terms of this first go-around. And you might indeed be able to sort of degrade the command and control abilities of the Islamic State. But two things are going to happen going forward that even if you're right, in some ways it's insane to expect really, significant progress inside of a month. I'll grant you that. But there is a question of whether or not this is, how this is going to play out down the road. And my concern is that first, the longer that the Islamic State is seen as going toe-to-toe with the United States in a conflict and not being destroyed, the more that actually its romantic appeal increases to a slightly different category of Muslim, perhaps, than the ones that are going over there to fight Assad, but nonetheless seen as relatively appealing. And the second thing is the extent to which this group sort of reorganizes itself to make sure or to sort of limit the impact of command and control strikes. So I grant you that on the one hand, this is going to force an adjustment by them because the U.S. is going to be continuing to attack them. On the other hand, I'm not sure it even seriously degrades them all that much. In some ways, I grant you that the patience thing is probably correct, but my concern is that actually the longer this goes on, the more likely Islamic State actually will wind up increasing its strength over time, not decreasing.
Well, some things we know from experience, not to presume that because it happened this way in Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan, it'll happen this way in Syria, but just sort of looking at the data points we have available. It is possible for bombing to force a group to spend so much time worrying about command and control that it becomes somewhat less effective. So that's not the same thing as destroy.
Right.
Second, it is possible to degrade and continue to degrade an organization's leadership. There's some suggestion, and I'm embarrassed that I'm not remembering who did the research on this, but I mean to credit someone did the research on this, and I mean to credit that person. That you're degrading their capability, but it has the downside that you make the groups ever more violent. Now, in the case of IS, it's not clear how much more violent you could make them.
Right.
But this phenomenon that you kill off a generation of older leaders who have some memory of the country or region before conflict, and you replace them with younger leaders who know nothing but conflict, have nothing else to go back to, who made their manhood in wartime. So it's not always the case that sort of managing a terror threat by decapitation makes the threat more manageable. And then third, just on total recruitment, in fact, al-Qaeda recruitment surged after the perception of success after 9/11, and the ability to recruit and retain top-level talent, if you forgive me for sounding like a consultant for a minute, has subsequently declined. And where is now able to recruit and retain top-level talent is these locally focused, groups that have very specific local grievances and local aims. So, Islamic State is a different model in that way, in that they're kind of trying to combine specific grievances in just one area, but also the universalist, we are the caliphate, we are the new manifestation of an Islamic State. So, on the one hand, sort of experience would lead you to believe that their appeal will decline, that after an initial surge of, these are the guys who are sticking it to the man, us being the man, that will decline. On the other hand, theirs is a new model, and so I don't think there's any reason to be overconfident about that.
That's fair. And in some ways you're correct that what makes the Islamic State different, the reason they broke off from al-Qaeda, for example, was the notion that they actually wanted to be a state. Ironically, this air assault might actually try to force them to adapt to becoming more like al-Qaeda 1.0, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I'll take your point on that. But that said, I have to admit I'm more pessimistic about this military operation than I've been about any in quite some time. So
pessimism is highly warranted because this is a god-awful situation, and so even the good outcomes are not very good. Because there is no good option for stability in the medium term in Syria.
No, Ross Douthat made a valid point yesterday, which I thought, which is to say that he was less critical of this operation, not because he thought there were any great outcomes in it, but because he thought really how much worse could the situation be. So in some ways it's impossible to make it that much worse. So with that said, we should probably shift to the rest of Obama's UN General Assembly speech, which struck me as, for lack of a better way of putting it, more pugnacious than you would have necessarily thought, especially in comparison to, let's say, his West Point speech from earlier in the summer. Because in this speech, as you say, he not only took on much of his Arab allies in the Middle East, he opened with an extremely especially by UN General Assembly standards, pretty blunt assessment of Russia's actions in Ukraine, which won't necessarily translate into action, but still, in some ways, that in and of itself, I was quite surprised by.
Well, I wanted to comment on that. I was in Germany last week and was astonished to hear elected German officials say, well, we don't really know what happened in Ukraine. And so having heard that, when I read Obama's speech, I thought, yes, I know exactly why this is there. Because there is the version of events which Obama recounted and which certainly appears to match the available data to me, is not universally believed even among our allies. So he was out there being pugnacious because there's a perceived problem. The other sort of two things, just while we're listing off, there were a lot of little pugnacious bits tucked in. There was an odd subtweet of China. There was one paragraph on the Asia Pacific, which as a speechwriter, I have tremendous empathy for, because it's that moment that someone comes running in and starts screaming at you, "How dare you leave out X?"
Yeah.
And you're like, all right, fine. You want me to put in a sentence about X? I'll put in a sentence about X. But, so there was a critique of China, but again, without mentioning China, which was interesting to me. And, I thought that the Palestinians were included in the general subtweeting of, sort of things that have been done wrong. I mean, whenever I see sort of hate in textbooks, I assume that included the Palestinians, but the Israelis were not subtweeted, but explicitly, I think the line was, "Some in Israel seem to have given up."
Yes.
Which was pretty, and there was not, in contrast to his past UN General Assembly speeches, where there was a lot of effort invested in sort of saying things about the region, and on the one hand, on the other hand, and just really doing all the bows you have to do to say anything about the Middle East peace process. This was, again, it was one paragraph, and it was kind of a blunt. Number one, this process is really important. Number two, Israelis, some of you have given up. And number three, anybody who ever, this was also sort of worth noting, all of you who claimed that the Israel-Palestine conflict is the source of all the hostility in the region, notice that you're wrong. I mean, that was also pretty blunt.
Okay, but here, and this is the most important thing. You want to know one of the people who claimed that it was in fact central to the region's problems? Barack Obama. Because if you go back and read what he wrote in his 2007 foreign affairs essay, when all the presidential candidates were starting to articulate their foreign policies, I still remember being struck by it when I read then, which was Obama genuinely thought in 2007, at least he wrote this, that at the heart of the Middle East peace, instability was in fact the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So, I mean, in some ways, I think events have proven his statement that he made at the UN General Assembly correct. But the other thing that was striking to me is the extent to which this speech contradicted the sort of priors that he had going into office beginning in 2009.
So, it's more complicated. You're right, and it's more complicated and less binary than you're making it, which also means it's less binary maybe than he's made it at some point. Yeah. But if the core problem, or a core problem in the Middle East, in fact, was autocracy and unrepresentative government, and it is also the case that the U.S. was involved in assisting a number of unrepresentative and autocratic governments to stay in power. Some of the felt need to do that, a considerable amount, but not all, of the felt need to do that flowed out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mm-hmm. So, it's not, I mean, the two things do have a relationship. It's, I think you can criticize him in 2007 just as you can criticize pretty nearly everybody else for not anticipating that the anger about autocracy would finally run out ahead of the anger on Israel-Palestine. Mm-hmm. But it's not the case that the two things are totally unrelated. No,
I don't mean, but in some ways I'm relying on his rhetoric here. I mean, you're right. I mean,
right, obviously, and it's also fair. I'll acknowledge that it's fair to sort of take the rhetoric and hold it up. That's a fair gotcha that you have there.
That's I was just saying I very rarely have the gotcha things, but in this case I think I actually have one. But I mean, in some ways I guess there's two other things that struck me about the speech. The first, which I actually really liked, and I thought was in some ways the most powerful part of the speech, was at his sort of last quarter of it, where he started by talking about Ferguson, Missouri, and then went from there. And I have to say, part of this is just, listening to the speech, it was clear that was the part of the speech that he really, I mean, he put a lot of energy into that. It was an extremely well-delivered portion of it. In no small part because I think the message is probably the one that he believes the most resolutely, which is that he can simultaneously say the United States it is appropriate for us to tell other countries, you need to get your house in order, even though we, the United States, do not have our house completely in order, but we at least acknowledge it and invite scrutiny from others, as opposed to these other regions that we need to focus on. I thought he articulated that extremely well, and he deserves credit for that. The second and somewhat more depressing point is that this is the second UN General Assembly speech in a row he's given where there's an incongruity here where I was actually in London last week, and I was at a conference on U.S. foreign policy, and I was discussing for all these papers talking about how the pivot or the rebalancing is the core part of the Obama grand strategy, and that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the core part of that pivot. And I almost didn't have the heart to tell these people that I don't think it was either of these things were quite as important as they were making them out to be. And in some ways, I'm not sure if this is a fair metric or not, but in both of the last two speeches that he's given to the UN General Assembly, the pivot's gotten a paragraph, or the Pacific Rim has gotten a paragraph at best. And as you suggest, it wouldn't shock me if that was something that was sort of inserted at the insistence of others that really wasn't a core part of the speech. The Middle East has been the major part of his addresses at the UN General Assembly. Now, maybe that's because that's the venue where talking about this is the most appropriate, but it does lead one to wonder whether or not, what looked like a coherent grand strategy in, let's say, the fall of 2011, does not look nearly as coherent now.
Well, let me ask you a question, and this is a sincere question.
Okay.
What about the Asia Pacific needs to be said or done at the UN General Assembly?
You would argue potentially adherence to the law of the sea and the notion of representing, peaceful ways of settling border disputes, and for that matter, with respect to the South China Sea, maybe multilateralizing that rather than China's preferred approach, which is dealing with each of these countries bilaterally. But that's not nothing. In some ways, it's telling that for all the talk about sort of geopolitical risk loosely put affecting markets. The only thing that would really spook markets at this point is, in fact, the idea of a potential war between between China and Japan and the Senkakus, or something more serious happening in the South China Sea. So I do think those things are appropriate to bring up at the UN.
That is a fair answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Can we actually, though, that I think brings us to another point, which is global warming.
Oh, yes,
which,
fair enough.
Originally, I think both the UN and the White House would have liked to see be the focus of this year's General Assembly. So how do we evaluate what happened at the meeting yesterday?
I'm going to defer to you slightly on this. I mean, I'll turn the question back on you, which is, what was your take? I'm modestly optimistic, but I want to know if I should be or
not. To my mind, it depends on what your scale for optimism is. I was interested to learn, that Obama plans to issue new targets for the U.S. next year. I think, and that's, potentially interesting and path setting, and I think identifies a moment where there is a certain amount of stuff he can do through executive orders and without Congress, and so that that was to me a signal of something interesting that's coming. What I don't feel like I have a good handle on, and nor did I get a good handle on from yesterday, is whether there's momentum, whether what happened yesterday will generate anywhere near the momentum needed to create anywhere near the collective action needed. So I saw a lot of rhetoric about lead up to next year, and I saw a lot of rhetoric about corporations getting involved, all of which is great and necessary. But what I, as just sort of concerned citizen, don't know is what's the trajectory.
No, that's fair. So let me put forward first the full disclosure, which is that I'm in some ways probably biased in the answer I give, because one of my closest colleagues here at Fletcher is now the point person in the White House for environmental cooperation with China, Kelly Sims Gallagher. And she's also one of the most competent people I've ever met. So as a result of that, I'm actually optimistic on this point, just because I have great faith in her abilities. That said, sort of stepping back, I would say there are two concerns I have, and I've talked about this before. The first is that it does seem like, both the United States and China are slowly recognizing that if the two of them at least act on something, you actually could have significant, that can jumpstart, more generally speaking, global progress, and that the alignment of interest both within the White House and within the Chinese, the Standing Committee, has been increasingly towards more aggressive action on climate change. So that's the optimistic spin you can put on that there is an agenda to be laid out, that you'll see it come up at the summit, the next Xi-Obama summit, and that can actually lay the groundwork for more forward progress. That said, there are two things that scare me about this. The first is domestic, and the second is international. The domestic is what happens if the Republicans win the Senate in the fall, because one of Mitch McConnell's sort of key talking points about what the Republicans will do if they control the Senate is, among other things, essentially hold the EPA hostage. In terms of instituting sort of line item restrictions on what the EPA can do with respect to the kind of regulations that Obama is talking about. And that can be a significant problem. The second and international one is that while the U.S. and China, and to some extent obviously the European Union might be on board, and that's not nothing. I mean, those are only the three largest economies in the world. I don't know if politically any sort of genuine global deal is going to be viable unless you get the other sort of major advanced developing countries to also sign on. And, you're getting weird signals coming out of places like India on this, where the Modi government does not sound – I mean, the fact that he didn't show up for the summit is not a great sign to begin with, but also he's made some odd-sounding noises on climate change that make me wonder just how committed he is to India making any serious, headway in terms of curbing its own emissions.
So, unusually, I'm actually going to express a little more optimism than you on the domestic politics front.
Okay.
Because I do think it's more likely than not that the Republicans will take the Senate, but I don't think they will take the Senate by enough to do sort of, I mean, they'll be able to sort of hold everything up and cause endless pain, but Republicans need, enough votes to survive losing what remains of their sort of moderate membership. And there's a couple that you could, go after pretty easily on the human health consequences. So, and I mean, it will require a lot of care and feeding to keep the coal state Democrats on side. But I don't think, of all the things that a Republican Senate will do, that doesn't strike me as one of the more slam dunk ones. So, so I feel a little more optimistic about that. Actually, that I want to slide to a last UN topic, which is very relevant to the Senate and possible change in control, and that is Iran. And really striking thing this year is how relatively little attention. I mean, it's all relative. But given that we have the deadline on the Iran nuclear talks coming up in 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and you have Rouhani in New York, sort of doing all the ritual things that Iranian leadership has done in New York, getting somewhat less attention this year. But the thing that's worth noting is while he's in New York, hardliners at home have sort of suddenly, unfortunately, gone on a binge of executing people and generally trying to signal to him that his bandwidth is very limited.
Right.
So I'm feeling anxious both about the scope that he has to get a deal with Washington, and then I do think that a Republican Senate will be able to tie the president's hands significantly more in a bipartisan way than has been the case up to now. So if they don't get that deal in November, I think the prospects for it plummet pretty dramatically. At the same time, by the way, to sort of loop back to the beginning of our conversation, now imagine a world in which the U.S. is fighting Assad, the U.S. is fighting ISIS, the U.S. is fighting Al-Qaeda, and by the way, the U.S. is also fighting the Shiites in Iran. That at a certain point, we're going to have to find some battles not to take on in the Middle East.
So let me close with this question to you, which is there a way in which if the Republicans take over the Senate, that could actually spur the negotiations, which is to say, there will be a lame duck session following the election. Could it be then that U.S. negotiators can go to Iran and say, look, this is the make or break moment from you. We can probably get a deal through with the existing Congress, which means we've got to do this now. Otherwise, there is simply no way domestically we will be able to get anything, even the most, the deal most, generous on our own terms through our own Congress. So, in international relations theory, Robert Putnam would call this the two-level game approach. But is there a way in which, if there's a GOP takeover of the Senate, that could actually accelerate closure of a deal?
Well, if I'm a U.S. negotiator, I certainly have that in my back pocket, and I'm beating it now, and I'm saying that the longer you wait, the more risk you take. Now, having said that, it's not clear to me that the Iranians are. I mean, it's kind of a four-level game.
No, the Iranians have their own two-level game issues. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
and so it's, my worry is that that there's a sort of a confluence of inflexibility at the key moment.
Yeah. No, I have to say that's my pessimism as well. It's where both negotiators probably do see a deal that they could actually achieve. I just don't know if hardliners, for lack of a better putting it on both sides, will potentially ratify it. But you're right. If that's the case, then we are now moving towards a world where I believe we will have singularly succeeded in making every potential faction in the Middle East our enemy.
Or not. Well, and the Kurds love us.
Oh, that's true. The Kurds love us. I forgot.
Great. And on that cheerful note,
yes,
Dr. Drezner, go teach.
I have to go teach, but always a pleasure, Heather.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
Take care.